Okay. I begin. It's a great honor to have young Toporowski speaking of Hyman Minsky. This actually reminds me of something which was told to us in Macerata, I think, by Mauro Gallegati, who was a close associate to Hyman Minsky. It seems that at a conference in at the University of the Marche, at the Politecnico of the Marche, the speaker introduced Minsky. Minsky himself began his speech saying, "It's a great honor to be here," and the presenter said, "It's a great honor to us," and Minsky replied, "That's what I meant." So this gives you an idea of the guy who was Hyman Minsky. I have a special connection to him, first of all because he was here since late 70s. He was introduced to Bergamo by the professor Piero Ferri, who has been rector of this university for many years, and he was the main figure in the introduction of the faculty of economics. Long time ago, we are speaking of the 78, 77, 78, 79. And I'm there since 77, actually. And Hyman Minsky is very famous for his studies on financial instability. The connection that I have with him is very personal, and it goes back to the numbers. The documents of my birth says that I was born at 7 p.m. 19, which is 1919. A day at lunch with my father and mother, long time ago, 30 years ago at least, I realized that my father was born in 1919. My mother was born in 1919. I did the dissertation about Rosa Luxemburg, which was referred today in the other Kaleski roundtable, and Rosa Luxemburg died in 1919. And when was Hyman Minsky? When Hyman Minsky was born? In 1919, because the father and mother were socialists, emigree from Russia. The revolution of 1905, I think, was the key factor, and they met at a dancing ballroom the year before, 1918. 1918 was a centenary for the birth of Karl Marx. So everything is linked together. I have the duty, because it has been written to me by the, I don't know what is the official name of the delegates for the pari opportunità, I don't know what is the English term, to remind the contribution of women to our discipline. Why? Because today is the 8th of March. The 8th of March is not a holiday, it's not la festa delle donne, how it is said. It is the International Women's Day, which was proposed in 1910 by some women of the social democracy, including Clara Zetkin, who was a close friend of Rosa Luxemburg. Everything holds together. In fact, it is very often forgotten, but there is a key contribution of women to economic science. In the case of Minsky, for sure, when he wrote his first great book, John Maynard Keynes, who was published in 75 or 76, I don't remember, it was published in those years, but it was written in the early 70s in Cambridge and benefited from the collaboration with another great economist who is John Robbins. As I said this morning, actually I would go farther than what says the Commissione per le Pari Opportunità, because today it has been proclaimed a strike, an international women's strike. And I would do a strike today. I am of the old school, so the old school means that when you do a strike, you don't go to work. Unfortunately, today it was not possible because I had the round table with Jan Toporowski and the lecture of Jan Toporowski this afternoon, and they cannot be moved. And they are really important. This is the first of a series of seminars of this year that me and Annamaria Variato will organize, dedicated to Minsky. The name of this series, with a great originality, I must say, sometimes I am so intelligent that I am scared of myself, is Minsky at 100. A colleague of us on Facebook said, why at 100? And that was something that you should never do. Go to Wikipedia and look, and you understand immediately why Minsky at 100. The opening theme today is Minsky and the problem of international debt. It is a very important theme and a very important lecture because actually Minsky almost never referred to the international dimension. If you take his books, they are, as it is the general theory of Keynes, something which speaks of a closed economy. You find very, very, very few instances in his writings, almost none. One of the most important is this conflict and interdependence in a multipolar world. I know it well because I had the manuscript in '85 from Hyman Minsky, and I published a translation of this. The translation was of Francesco Cefaloni in an issue about the United States of the journal Metamorphosis. So there are differences because mine was based on the manuscripts. This is published in Studies in Banking and Finance, and it has been changed here and there in a few places by Minsky. It is, we may discuss this when we will have our groups. This is a text which poses some problems to some contemporary followers of Hyman Minsky, like the people of the so-called modern monetary theory, because there are things that they don't like very much. I don't know if it will be discussed by Jan or not. I leave the word to Jan. Our structure will be different than the other days because this is a formal lecture open also to people who are not in this course. So you will speak 1 hour and 15 minutes. There will be no break. There will be a discussion. The discussion will be me and Annamaria Variato in the reverse order probably, and maybe Gary Dymsky. I don't know if Gary Dymsky will appear or not.
Sorry.
No problem.
It's my,
you lost the least interesting part, my presentation. So yeah. I go there so I see.
Okay. Thank you.
I try to focus. Out of focus. This should be out of focus. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I too have a personal connection with Minsky in that I met him. I did meet him a couple of times. I tried to engage in conversation, in discussion with, more theoretical discussion with him, and I found that this was unsuccessful. But a few years ago, when Victoria Chick retired, I was very close friends with Victoria Chick, and Victoria Chick had been taught by Minsky at Berkeley. Minsky had his first position in the 1950s was at Berkeley, and and they corresponded afterwards, and in particular over various over articles for I think a book that she edited, and one or two other things. And she told me the story that everyone who read anything that Minsky wrote found his prose execrable. I mean, it was very disjointed and sometimes difficult to understand. And then he repeated himself to try and make his what he wanted to say clear. And Vicky was trying to clear up this terrible prose and reproached him with it, to which he responded, yes, I know, Vicky, but you have to remember that English is my second language. And it was indeed. His first language was the language of his parents, which was Yiddish. So, in any case, after that, yes, Vicky retired, and she said she had to clear out a very large office, which was stuffed full of books and files, and she gave me a folder, and she said, that's for you. And what was it? It was her correspondence with Minsky. So I had this somewhere in my office, and I hope I'll find it before I clear it out.
Don't send it to me.
Okay. Anyhow, what I shall do today, I've taken parts of a lecture which is a standard lecture which I give to my students at SOAS on Hyman Minsky, which concerns the second version of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. I think people don't realise that there were Minsky changed his hypothesis, and if you read his works altogether, you can find at least three different versions. The most famous one, I guess, and the one that I will present I'll present in abbreviated form, is his second one. I'll say something about implications for international debt, referring to the paper that Riccardo has, and then look at what I think is the major weak link in the international system, which is the growing dependence on dollar swaps, US dollar swaps, as part of what Minsky was concerned about, which was always debt structures. For him, when you analyse an economy, you have to analyse the debt structures. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And that's why the macroeconomics doesn't make sense. There's no money in it. Okay, this, for the financial instability hypothesis, the second version is really the one that appears in Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. Now, I'm not going to go through the model which he he talks about there, but I'll just use certain accounting identities. Minsky was unusual in that because of his, he'd spent a year on Wall Street, he understood accounts in a way that most economists don't. And the standard terminology is if you use sales revenue minus production costs, this gives you operating profit. And this is the operating profit for a firm that in standard economic theory the firm should be maximising. If you from out, however, out of operating profit, you have to deduct payments on financial obligations, debt and equity, and this, if you deduct all this, you get retained profits, and these are the reserves of firms. The cash flow of the net cash flow of a company is retained profits plus the sale of assets plus the issue of new financial obligations. So Minsky's great insight was the realization that merely maximizing operating profit is, which is what most economists do, is deceptive. What you have to do is you have to take a cash flow approach, which is the approach that accountants take. For accountants, the profit maximizing that economists talk about is meaningless. What they look at when they look at how a company is performing is its cash flow. Now, where does the cash flow come from? Well, it actually comes from, in the aggregate, Kalecki's theory of profits. So that when he published this second edition, he stumbled across what was in Keynes, but it was really systematically put forward by Kalecki in his theory of profits. So you have an extension of my Kalecki lecture this morning. If you take savings can consist of two elements. One is the retained profits of firms, and the second is household saving. In the new classical theory, of course, there aren't firms, so it's just household saving. But in practice, it's the retained profits of firms that count. And if you look at, if you start with the national income accounts, you find that total saving in an economy is equal to firms' gross fixed capital formation, its investment, plus the fiscal deficit, government expenditure minus revenue, plus the trade surplus. And the trade surplus is exports minus imports. Now, if you take out those last two elements, the fiscal deficit and surplus, you assume a balanced budget and perhaps balanced foreign trade, you have this standard equation of savings equal to investment. And then what Kalecki did, and what Minsky also did in stabilizing our stable economy, you assume that there are two classes in society, capitalists and workers. Capitalists save and workers save. Capitalists consume and workers consume. So that if you take this saving and investment equation and you set it you divide up capitalist saving like this, you get an equation for capitalist saving is equal to investment minus workers' saving. Now, go back to capitalists. Profits are equal to capitalist saving plus capitalist consumption. That's what capitalists do with their profits. So you put that into this equation. So you have this capitalist saving plus capitalist consumption is equal to investment plus capitalist consumption minus workers' saving. Let's just simplify a little bit. Assume that workers are saving as much as capitalists are consuming. So in any case, this is a minor, it's a balancing item. You get the famous equation that profits are equal to investment. And question is, well, yes, this is true, but you've derived all this from national income identities. What is the direction of causation? And the direction of causation for Kalecki was very simple. And this is what he wrote. What is the proper meaning of this equation? Does it mean that profits in a certain period determine capitalist consumption and investment or saving, or the other way around? The answer to this question depends on which of these items is directly subject to the decisions of capitalists. And here's his great insight. Now, it is clear that they may decide to consume and invest more in a certain short period than in the preceding period, but they cannot decide to earn more. It is therefore their investment and consumption decisions which determine profits and not vice versa. A very important insight which is lost in neoclassical economics. Why is it lost in neoclassical economics? Because in neoclassical economics, you decide your income. You decide your income by your decision of how much of your resources, labour or whatever, or capital, you decide to sell. Whereas Kalecki had this blinding realization, no, that's the one thing that you don't decide on. You can decide how much you spend and what you spend on, but you cannot decide how much income you will receive. Even the professors here, we don't decide our incomes. The university decides for us. There's a link with Marx and Keynes. Why? Because Marx was the first person to ask the question of how is it that capitalists receive profits? Yes, capitalists exploit their workers, but they exploit their workers by making them work for longer than is necessary to pay for their wages. But capitalists don't want surplus goods. A car company does not want profits in the form of cars, which the surplus cars that they can't sell to their workers. You can't solve this problem by raising wages, because that raises your costs. Who do you sell the surplus cars to? And Marx had this insight that you can turn those surplus cars into money by the capitalists buying them. And similarly, Keynes, by a similar process, of deduction realised that actually to make a profit, firms need to invest, entrepreneurs need to invest, and they need to consume. And actually, if you look at this passage in Keynes's work, his friends in Cambridge couldn't understand this. And Robinson, E.A.G. Robinson, Joan Robinson's husband, even wrote to him, and he said, "Do you mean that when a capitalist goes to have his shoes polished and pays the man on the street who polishes his shoes, that he makes a profit that way?" And he couldn't understand it. Whereas Keynes, who understood the way the whole system worked, said, yes, indeed it does, because that shoe shine man now has money to buy goods that are sold, that have been sold by a capitalist factory. So it works like this. And in Minsky, Minsky picked up a similar idea that Kalecki had, that over the business cycle, investment fluctuates. And therefore, because of this, profits also fluctuate over the business cycle. They rise in the boom and fall in the recession, along with investment. But Minsky's great insight was the realization that when firms decide on their investment, they decide in the light of an inherited debt structure. This was where his obsession with debt structures came. The ones that the debts that a firm has today can't change. Maybe able to change them tomorrow. If it has the services of an investment banker, it can change its balance sheet, but it can't change them today. Nor can it change the profits that it makes. And therefore, what you have is this is what sets off the crisis that brings about a recession. And you get excessive financial liabilities as investment and profits fall. If you add in the government sector and the foreign sector, you have saving equal to investment plus the fiscal deficit plus the foreign current account surplus, so that profits in the expanded version, in the systematic version that you find in Kalecki, is the profits are equal to investment plus the fiscal deficit plus the current account surplus plus capitalist consumption minus workers' savings. And this is Kalecki's profits equation, macroeconomic profits equation, which then gets taken over by Minsky. And actually in Kalecki you get something else which is derived from Marx, the price system. What's the function of the price system in Kalecki's in this total system? Well, if you look at neoclassical economics, for neoclassical economics, the price system is what brings the economy into equilibrium. Supply and demand in all markets into equilibrium. Yes, that's wonderful, but in Kalecki it's trivial. The function of the price system is the distribution of those profits among different firms. That's what the price system does. In accordance with their their profit margin and their degree of monopoly. Their degree of monopoly determines the profit margin. Firms have different profit margins. And this is why if you see something that calls itself a Neo-Kaleckian model, which gives you an aggregate profit margin, or if you find if you look at those models which look at the wage share or the profit share, what's wrong with them? Well, what's wrong with them is that they're missing out this connection between the price system and macroeconomics. I don't want to go into this. It's I think one of the wonders of studying Kalecki and Marx. I now come to this important paper that Riccardo Bellofiore was talking about, the implications for international debt. I'll go through it quickly because no doubt it will be referred to later on. Minsky in this article says there is a vast network of dollar-denominated debt which leads to large cash flows to the United States entities and to the non-US banks and nationals that own dollar-denominated assets. So what Minsky was talking about was the emergence in the 1980s of a system where actually the flows, the money flows around international money flows were far greater than actual trade. And he's talking about those. When I say far greater, something like 5% of international capital flows were trade related. The rest were these financial flows. And since then it's probably reduced even further. This structure makes the United States analogous to a bank and the rest of the world analogous to depositors and borrowers. For its currency and financial center to function as the world's currency and financial center, two criteria need to be satisfied with the rest of the world can acquire sufficient amounts of its currency so that payment commitments can be fulfilled, and the central bank and national economic policy of the key currency country can make its currency scarce without extracting too high a price, in other words, in exchange rate changes and the rate of interest from either home or foreign countries. That's the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, he went on to say, must function as a lender of last resort to the international financial system. The international financial structure leads to flows of payments in the currency of the denomination of the debts. Well, again, he's repeating himself. From debtors to bankers and from banks to depositors. The normal functioning of this structure of financial linkages also requires that there be a flow of funds from depositors to banks and from banks to borrowers. And now a comment which is very relevant to today. Protectionism in the form of tariffs or quotas by the United States will tend to make things worse, not better. There is no solution. Minsky was writing at this time in the middle of the international debt crisis. Actually, around 1986, this was where I met him. And without a large US trade deficit, allowing the rest of the world to acquire dollar deposits without borrowing them. This is the importance of the trade deficit. I think I have a graph somewhere tracking the US trade deficit since the 1980s at least, or 1970s, and you find that the narrowing of the trade deficit is always associated with crises in the rest of the world. Why? Because what happens in trade, exports to the US are a way of acquiring dollars without borrowing them. And that's these free dollars, i.e. ones that aren't a future liability, you can only do with trade. One key requirement is for the United States to achieve and maintain a closer approximation to full employment without restricting imports. Where have we heard this before? Balog, yesterday, Kaletsky and Schumacher. So Minsky's coming back to those ideas, but without completely unaware of the Kaletsky-Balog discussion. But the United States cannot do it alone. The other rich countries, Japan and Western Europe in particular, need to help by maintaining their own prosperity without depending upon a strong balance of trade surplus. Since 1980, the United States, Japan, and the affluent countries of Europe have not done their part. He's talking about the rise of the period of monetarism. Without international understanding and cooperation, a cross of debt will replace Brian's cross of gold, i.e. the gold standard. Who was Brian, or what was he referring to? I have this because I recently wrote a paper on populism. And here it is, William Jennings Bryan, Democratic candidate for the presidency in 1896, expressing the distrust of populists, by and large poorer people, a lot of rural farmers, distrust of cosmopolitan elites and international finance at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1896. He had this, at the end of his speech that goes as follows: having behind us the commercial interests and the labouring interests and all the toiling masses, we shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labour this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. And this, of course, this was very rousing stuff, the biblical reference. And Brian used to repeat this, in other speeches. In fact, Brian lost to the Republican William McKinley. And Brian himself was not that radical. His alternative was bimetallism, which was the use of silver in addition to gold in coinage, to overcome what appeared as a shortage of money in a country oppressed by debt and deflation, which is a credit problem. It's not a problem of shortage of money. And I think this is sometimes forgotten by people, this is forgotten today by people who tell you, oh, we can sort all these problems out just by doing something with the money. There isn't a money solution. Let me move to international debt structures. For Minsky, therefore, you had international debt structures which had to be fed, regularly fed, with a trade deficit of the country in whose currency the debts are denominated, and plus additional lending. This, as I said, is Kalecki, Schumacher, Balog. I want to focus on one particular feature of this, which is the rise of US dollar swaps. US dollar swaps, it's actually very difficult to get data on this. So can you read this? No, you can't. They're all going up. No. What it is that the the ones at the top, that's the important ones, are the euro ones. And that's really the most important thing. The pink ones at the bottom is Japan. These are just the numbers of dollar swaps, starting with the year 2001, setting 2001 as equal to 100. Now, so that this gives you the volume. That's actually, it's difficult to get these figures. The Bank for International Settlements collates them by means of a survey every 3 years. So this isn't high frequency data. Foreign exchange swaps, here we are, here's some. The one at the top is the euro. The next one is, I think, Japanese yen. The green one is the pound sterling. That's the crucial nature of London. That's what London's going to lose when we go out of the European Union and others. Now, I've explained that these are big and they're growing. It's the important thing to know. What are they? What's a foreign exchange swap? A US bank borrows US dollars against the security of an investment grade, a AAA rated securities. That's a US government bonds, some corporate bonds. The US bank, so let's say Citibank, swaps the US dollars with a European bank, Unicredit, for the equivalent in euros, hedged by a repurchase agreement to sell back the euros for US dollars in 3 months' time at the same exchange rate. So it's at the same exchange rate, there's no exchange rate risk. Now there's a controversy as to what is this. We know that they're there and they're growing. The official view from the Bank of England, their handbook in their centre for training refers to them as derivatives. Derivatives are useful for risk management. They can reduce costs, enhance returns, allow investors to manage risks with greater certainty and precision. An issuer may find it difficult or even impossible on account of legal or other restrictions to issue in a particular currency. Hence it may be important, e.g. for hedging purposes or for asset and liability management of the country, to have its liability in that currency. It therefore may choose to borrow in another currency and swap the proceeds. This allows the borrower to raise the necessary funds and have the net liability in the chosen currency. So with derivatives, very often investors seek arbitrage returns. If you look at, even central bankers do this. The Reserve Bank of Australia engages in the carry trade. It borrows yen to exchange them for other currencies which have higher interest rates, let's say the Australian currency. It builds up reserves in yen, swapping into US dollars. The Bank for International Settlements, where a lot of central banks keep their deposits, they also engage in swaps for the purpose of actually making a profit to cover their costs. Now, the alternative view is that this is a money market instrument. What are money market instruments? Well, the money markets are the interbank markets. In the interbank markets, banks borrow and lend from each other on an unhedged basis. You borrow, a bank borrows because it's a registered bank, and it borrows with a commitment to return, but there's no, it borrows on the reputation of the bank. And if you read the textbooks, this is how banks are supposed to regulate their liquidity. Now, what you find with foreign exchange swaps is that they're hedged on another currency. If you look at this, that explanation of this, of how the foreign exchange swap happens, each transaction is hedged with a commitment which will allow this to be satisfied. The only, there's no exchange rate risk. The only possible risk is counterparty risk, but it's not among recognized banks, this is not the case. And so but it's hedged by a commitment always to reverse the swap at some future date. And it was my friend Fotis Sandrew who, when he was doing his early investigations into banking and finance, he noted that the currency swap people don't sit on the derivatives desk, they sit on the money markets desk. What's the difference? Well, the derivatives desk is the desk that makes a profit for the bank by trading in derivatives. The money market desk has only one function, and that is to regulate the liquidity of the bank. It's a liquidity function. And now I got interested in this, and I started asking around and found out that why are the money markets in decline and dollar swaps expanding? And the reason is that under the Basel regulations, currency swaps offer a cheaper way of borrowing than the interbank market. Because it's risk-free borrowing, apart from counterparty risk, it's risk-free borrowing, it's hedged with good security, it doesn't require capital backing. If a bank wants to regulate its money markets, it tries to regulate its liquidity by borrowing in the interbank market, it has to set capital aside for it. If it does it through currency swaps, it doesn't have to do this. So it's cheaper. Where does this leave where does it leave the standard banking practice? Well, if you look at what central banks do, their target is the target in the money market, interestingly enough. And what is the money market? Well, since the financial crisis, the money market has been brought, as they say, brought onto the balance sheet of the central bank. The central bank manages the money markets. So needless to say, their target rate of interest always holds because they run the money market. But that is not where banks are going. Banks are going to the currency swaps market. In fact, the interbank hasn't declined, but it's migrated even before 2008 to the currency swaps market because of this regulation of unhedged borrowing, because of financial instability, and because swaps are cheaper. You know, there's a standard format for swaps which you can do quite easily. Some Minsky implications of this. First of all, a much more widespread holding of US dollar deposits. The foundation of the whole of the money markets of the world is increasingly the US dollar. Even domestic dollar borrowing and lending in Europe is backed by US dollars and US dollar securities. This is what John Grahl calls the dollarization of Europe. We don't see this in Europe because this is an interbank phenomenon. But the banks are maintaining their liquidity with dollars, not with euros. There is, from this emerges various other distortions, a shortage of good US securities to hedge US borrowing. And then, this is part of John Graal's argument, of course, what happens in Europe? European government bonds are stigmatized. If European governments issue bonds, they get, the markets are careful about absorbing them. Why? Because the ECB won't necessarily buy them. They will buy German bonds, but the German government is the only one that doesn't need to borrow so much. So there's an even greater shortage of good European government bonds, which, if you understand this process, that should be the backing for European banks to manage their liquidity. And what happened, one of the interesting side stories of the crisis in America, because of the crisis in the US dollar money markets in 2007, this made European banks unable to roll over their borrow to repay existing short-term borrowing, their US dollar commitments. That's effectively how the crisis in America hit European banks. Now, the Federal Reserve actually had limited liquidity swap agreements with the European Central Bank since 2002. These were, as I said, these commitments that they would lend up to a certain amount of dollars and to be swapped back at the same exchange rate 3 months later. In 2007, these were extended to the Reserve Bank of Australia. In the middle of the crisis, the Banco Central do Brasil, the Bank of Canada, Denmark's National Bank, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Korea, Banco de Mexico, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, a whole shoal of these banks. Why? Because their commercial banks, the commercial banks in those countries, were unable to roll over their dollar swaps. So the idea was that they would then go to their central bank, and the central bank would lend them dollars. But the central bank didn't have dollars because they issued the national currency. But they could get them through these swaps. So these swaps were a way of resolving the crisis. In May 2010, you can find all this actually on the Federal Reserve website. In May 2010, due to strains, they even use the term strains in short-term US dollar money markets, the Federal Reserve authorised dollar liquidity lines with Bank of England, Bank of Canada, European Central Bank, etc. Again, to allow these central banks to lend dollars to their commercial bank. And in October 2013, the Federal Reserve, because all these tend to have end dates, these central banks announced that their existing temporary arrangements, including dollar liquidity swap lines, will be converted to standing arrangements that will remain in place until further notice. Let me I'm now coming to the end. What's the political significance of these foreign exchange swaps? Well, as I've already mentioned, the shortage of good US dollar is this imbalance of a shortage of good US securities to hedge the US borrowing, as opposed to the stigmatization of US government bonds. So this is John Graal's view that the euro will never become a true international currency without government bonds. And what I think is intriguing, another political implication of this, is you look at the way in which Trump is playing fast and loose with sanctions. The sanctions against Iran, for example, they're a threat to financial stability in Europe because of the dependence of non-US banks on US dollar swaps. If Siemens wanted to do business with, Siemens in Germany wanted to do business with Iran, it wouldn't be able to do it. No European bank would finance it. Why? Because they'd immediately have their US dollar swaps blocked. They wouldn't be able to get US dollar swaps from a US bank, because the US bank would be subject to those sanctions. So this is a source of instability. Okay, my conclusion from this is that simply is simple. The key to understanding the international monetary and financial system is that it's not a system of international trade and exchange. We've got beyond this. And in this sense, we've got a bit beyond even what Schumacher, Peletsky and Balog were talking about. It's not a system of international saving and exchange, as you can find in many of the development studies, development economics textbooks. And what they are debt structures, what Minsky said, they're debt structures that need accommodating trade flows and credit creation. Okay.
Thank you very much. Probably you have never seen these things happening, but this is what happens after a lecture, maybe, or an intervention at a conference in which there is a discussion from other authors of what was said by the speaker. So this time I will begin with Annamaria, if she wishes. It's okay? It's up to you.
First the
First guy.
guest.
Okay.
So first the guest.
Because you were here, you prepared your intervention, we are completely
Full of caffeine, yes.
full caffeine. Yeah. So,
Right.
You have to digest this.
Okay, Gary.
All right, so I think would first of all like to say that my opinion is right. That Riccardo is right about Jan, and I hope that you can appreciate that when you take micro and macro classes, and even finance classes, you're not actually going to be getting monetary economics and monetary perspectives and financial perspectives in the way that you do when you take classes with these two teachers here, Annamaria and Riccardo, are very special in the world of economics. And so you're getting a richness in the way that you're understanding things that is very special. So please try to think on that. I have three reactions, or three things to say. The first one is that Minsky, you notice that what Jan did is he jumped from Minsky talking about his usual stuff, financial instability and so on, and then the next thing you know, we were talking about the international system and the international problems. Now, that's because, in a certain way, he was pushed there to make that jump. But that jump, and when he says that Minsky had 3 phases of his financial instability hypothesis, there's like one phase from the mid-1970s, which is like the naive phase, where you actually can't understand anything that Minsky writes. Then there's the, don't you think, I mean, it's fair to say. Then there's the like 1981 through 86 phase, which goes to the that book that he cited, and where Minsky makes more sense, and I'm going to focus on what he says then, because he thinks he figures it out. Then if you go to the early 1990s, you'll see phase, and actually Minsky dies in 1996 in the spring, or in the summer, early summer. And toward the end of his life, including a very interesting article from, I think it's June of 1996, you see the third phase, where he's despairing because of what he calls the emergence of money market capitalism, which had everything to do with the kinds of developments that Jan was talking about, this complex global system. So, first comment. Minsky's solution for periods of financial instability, when debt builds up beyond the capacity of countries and people to pay, was what he used to call big government and big bank. Actually, big bank, big government. He used to walk around and say things like this. He was very cryptic. And big bank, he meant the central bank. And what he meant was that when there was a crisis, because there was too much debt to be paid, asset prices were collapsing, the financial markets are running, the kind of scenario of the big credit, the big crises we've seen in the last 10 years, that in that moment, the central bank has to step up and basically provide reserves into the system. It has to be the big bank. Just keep pumping reserves, whatever that means, the currency, whatever it is, dollars or euros or yen or whatever, until the markets are satisfied, because what people are doing then is they're running to safety. And the idea is that when they run to safety, they want to get out of whatever devaluing asset that they're in, and they want to go to something that they feel is safe, which would be, say, the dollar or the yen or the Swiss dollar, etc., the Swiss franc, etc. Now, the problem there is that this is a very U.S.-centric vision, because basically the U.S. Federal Reserve can certainly issue dollars without reserve, but no other bank can really do that. In developing countries, if, say, the Brazilian central bank issues dollars or its own reais, real, the markets are going to say, we don't want these real, they're going to sell them off, and the currency will devalue. Of course, it's even worse in Europe in this sense, in that, say, when a European country has problems, it doesn't have the ability to emit its own national currency. There is no such thing. So you need other kinds of adjustments, which can be very brutal. And there's where Jan's critique of the European Central Bank is well taken. Now, in terms of big government, now what's supposed to happen after the big bank comes in is that big government is then supposed to come in, and what you have after we stabilize the financial markets is that we now have this shortage of aggregate demand. So big government should come in and spend, and make sure there's enough demand so we can start to establish a new floor for this economy and get it going again. And now the problem there, of course, is that, again, that's a very US-centric view, and go back and read what Balog said, that in a global system, in the way it was set up, go check it out and think about that the US, running deficits in different ways was very important for the stability of the global system. But basically, no other country can necessarily do that. And I would just mention, let's just go right back to Europe for a minute and just think about all the rules of the European community, especially the Eurozone. When the countries go beyond the limits, they get penalized or worried or disciplined, and that's a problem. So basically you have these kind of asymmetries. Now that asymmetry is kind of there in terms of, that's when Jan makes the jump to the international system. And if you will, he gives us this equation. I've rewritten it. It's just what he wrote. I took out capitalist savings and workers. I took out the minor stuff, and we just have the big stuff because there's not much room over there. So what it is look at the U.S. Okay, for the U.S., what I did is now I took current account surplus, which was on the other side, and I flipped it over. So what's happening is this. The U.S., you got profits, that's their savings, and then you've got current account surplus. Well, the U.S. has a current account deficit. That's those two, that big negative on top of it. That means a flow of money into the U.S. So those are the savings from abroad and from the U.S., profits, so on, that are available to take care of what? To finance investment plus the fiscal deficit. So that's the system there. Now in the rest of the world though, basically we can't trade with Mars, so everything's got to add up across borders. And so what we got in the rest of the world is basically you have profits on the left again, but this time you've got what's profits taken care of. You've got investment plus you've got a current account surplus. Now that surplus is being shipped off across the water to the U.S. in this case in net terms, and then your fiscal deficit. So notice there's a lot less to work with. Now so the asymmetry, cui bono, who pays, is crucial. I got something on that, but let me just go to what it is. It's from my friend Jane DeRista of the Levy Institute, and Jane talks about the fact that basically what we have is a system in which basically we have this persistent. Okay, I'm just going to quote more or less from Jane for a sentence. She's got a book called All Fall Down. It is brilliant. She's a very elderly scholar, but Jane DeRista is the real deal. Here's what she writes. The persistent neoliberal era U.S. current account deficit implies that developing economies' holdings of U.S. liabilities are supporting financialization globally and increasing pressures that destabilize governments and increase the returns to global financial predation. In other words, basically, the excess consumption of the U.S. is being financed by the rest of the world holding its debt. Now, this leads me to my final point, which is about the shortage of safe assets. You heard safe assets. You heard a really brilliant exposition about the way that the money market's been transformed. And what I want to say is that in current macro, if you go to your library search items, looking like the American Economic Review and so on, and look up a guy called Riccardo Caballero. Caballero is at MIT, very distinguished economist, and he's got a whole series of papers on the shortage of safe assets. Now, what he means is basically that in this world, we have too few safe assets. Now, he's looking at reserves. Now, think about it. What's happening in this system here is that basically the dollars that are buying assets elsewhere in the world, or goods elsewhere in the world, are ending up in the treasuries of foreign banks. And basically, the shortage of safe assets controversy is Caballero and others saying, why don't we see more currencies from other countries? What's wrong with these other countries? How come we don't see yen reserves and Swiss franc reserves and other reserves more, or for that matter, real reserves, and so on? And the answer, of course, is because of the structural imbalances in the global system. But let me read you the abstract from the first article where Caballero just introduces this problem. And then I'll be quiet. 2009. The U.S. is engulfed in the most severe financial crisis since the Great Depression. Okay. A key factor behind this crisis is the large demand for riskless assets from the rest of the world. The rest of the world is looking for U.S. assets. Okay, in this paper we show how this demand not only triggered a rise in capital imbalance. Okay, let me not read that. What he's saying is this, basically that what's driving this whole thing where we see this current account in the deficit in the U.S. is that the rest of the world wants safety in their asset holdings. They don't have safety, they aren't able to be safe, so that the savers in their economies are scared of holding any paper other than good old U.S. bonds and U.S. Treasury securities. And so essentially, they will gladly run a current account surplus with the U.S. so they can use that surplus to go and buy U.S. currency and bring it home. And if other countries want to rebalance everything, they've got to get safer. And how do other countries get safer? Quit running budget deficits, quit having improper policies, and so on, because basically, the U.S. makes the rules. You can see how they turn this whole thing inside out. Now, that's why I said this insight is something that most people don't understand. You have a chance to get there because of the way that you've been taught in these modules with your two professors. So think on it, try to connect the dots, keep your eye on the target. There's power moving behind these asset movements. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind, very kind remark. And so I feel ashamed in this aspect. Well, I just want to make a few points because it's very late, and I very much agree with what Jan said, and also Gary was saying. So I just make a very few remarks and just matters of curiosity. We saw in different ways, and also in this page, to come the reference from William Jennings Bryan, and I this make a connection. I became somehow close to Minsky because as a student I was going to the computer lab, and I was working on my dissertation, and he was coming to the computer lab in order to check his email. When he was
in St. Louis?
No, in Bergamo. And so I was writing my dissertation, undergraduate dissertation, and he was coming, and then he was looking at me, and one day he asked me, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on a dissertation on financial constraints." But then he said, and all of a sudden I say, "Have you ever read The Wizard of Oz?" And the novel of The Wizard of Oz. And I said, "Yes, of course I did as a child. And do you know the meaning of this, the economic meaning of this novel?" And I said, "No, I just know the metaphor, like the novel for a child, but I don't know the meaning, the economic meaning of this history." And it turns out that this history is also the metaphor of the history of the United States during the years of at the end of the 19th century. And it turns out that The Wizard of Oz and this history is about the struggle between bimetallism, so golden exchange rate, and another money, dollar money denominated with silver. And so William Jennings Bryan was the populist, but was also in the novel the coward lion that Dorothy meets in the novel. So the lion, the coward lions, and so it's a connection. So you were mentioning this one, but also for Minsky, these people was important. It was important to me, as I told in the afternoon with Gary Dymsky, because it turns out that I got the respect from Hyman Minsky because he realized that I really read The Wizard of Oz. Because when I told him, well, I've read this novel, I told, when Dorothy comes back to her home, she loses the silver shoes. Usually people who do not read the novel present Dorothy wearing red shoes. But it turns out that she wears silver shoes. But anyway, this link is about the fact that about the money and the role of money in the and finance in the international system. I just want to point two things. So not as a point of curiosity. And in some point, Jan was saying that the Basel Agreement were changing the ways in which liquidity moves inside the European system. I think that this link between liquidity and stability goes and changes because the settlements behind the Basel rules are going to increase instability. In some sense, they are going to create mechanism through which liquidity is going to vanish very quickly. And in particular, there is the connection between not only the Basel agreements, but also the change in the accounting principles. Because the way in which the accounting principles, the new accounting principles, the new standards affect the particular way in which the banking sector makes the balance sheet affects exactly the portfolio, or the liquidity portfolio of banks. And so these swaps are now going to be technically treated in a different way, I think, than the one you mentioned in your paper. But this is just this is not a criticism. It's just even a stronger point. So the fact that the system is going to become even much weaker in this respect, with this kind of technical agreements in the financial market. And finally, the last point goes creating a connection between the very young Toporowski writings on the theories of financial disturbances and Hyman Minsky idea of financial instability. I think one of the point which is emphasized by Jan, and obviously which is critical in Minskyan vision, is the fact that in order to have financial instability, finance has to be critical. And so finance is supposed to be the cause of the change in the economic system. And finance and then credit is something different than money. So in some sense, this is a very big difference between the approach to financial crisis and the Keynesian approach to instability, in which money matters, but it is critical money, not finance, which is critical. And so this kind of theoretical development is very important, because as long as we emphasize the channel, which is a financial channel, we then have a further way through which we can understand the way in which cycles are spread and create themselves in the system. And in this case, the settlements inside the money market are no longer critical, but they just become the transmission mechanism. So in this, so the perspective can be integrated. We have two complementary explanation, but still in this vision of critical finance, we do not necessarily need, at least theoretically, to have money critical, because at least from a very theoretical point of view, we may just have reflective money, and so not so essential, not so essential money, because the origin of instability is financial. And so these are the remarks that I wanted to point out, and thank you for your.
I'm not sure I did my duty, because I didn't present Gary Dymsky, but you have seen him before. He is a professor at Leeds, though he's from the United States. He has been in California for sure, and in Brazil teaching. Probably you don't know Annamaria Variato, or you know her from here. Annamaria Variato is the other macroeconomist of the department, actually. And she has done a PhD with Minsky in St. Louis, and she's teaching macroeconomics theories and applications. We teach together that course. I don't have too much to argue now. We will go back in the presentations on these papers. I just give you some context on 2 or 3 things of this paper, about this paper, and the debate that can be going on today about this kind of things. First, the context. As I told you, I published an Italian version in '86, and the article is in English is '86, but it is '84 actually. And I gave you some historical context in the first 2 lectures of this course. The situation was very different from the point of view of international monetary economy, both relatively to the originally not so pure, but let us say almost pure gold standard of the end of the 19th century until World War II. Then, of course, there was the period of the chaos and the confusions between the wars. Then there was the so-called gold exchange standard with the dollar at the yard. Then there was the policy change in '79. The policy change in '79, unfortunately my copies are not quite reasonable. The policy change of '79 was the move towards monetarism, and Volcker, Reagan, and Thatcher. On the background of Hyman Minsky's mind, there is this idea that the system tends to instability, and instability is not the usual Keynesian one. He has been criticized also for this downward instability, or instability leading to depression, but there is also an upward instability. The systems being characterized by an endogenous instability should, in the mind of the critical of this approach, result in complete chaos. But what you see in reality is some kind of order. And what Minsky says is this is institutionally defined by the definitions by institutions of floor and ceilings. So the first thing, very important, is the attention to the institutions which change in these different periods. And this is true always for political economy, but it is even more true for international monetary economics. You can't just look at the economic machine. It is much more complicated. Actually, a course like this would be elsewhere a course related to the discipline that in Italian is not very well known, which is international political economy, in which you mix economic theory with sociology, political theory, and so on. What was going on as a change in '79 led, as I told you a second ago, to monetarism. But the point of view of Minsky is that monetarism was a very short-lived experience. If I understood Jan, he reminded that for him English is the second language, and for Hyman Minsky, I don't know if it could be called English, US English was the second language. Now I am in general a slow learner, and this is true also for English. When I met Minsky, I strictly almost didn't understand a word. I was convinced that it was my fault. Then I started to question myself and started to think that in the Midwest, they speak in this way. It was not true. I met people from the Midwest, and more or less I managed to understand them. I understand quite well people from California. There is a financial economist. When I met her, she was a blonde, very young, Doreen Eisenberg, and they asked her how it is possible that I don't understand immediately Bob Dylan and I understand every single word of Jackson Brown. And she came from California and said, because he comes from California. Then I realized that the problem was that for Ivan Minsky, the first language was Yiddish. Why this long parenthesis? Because in times I developed this idea that monetarism was a parenthesis, and I realized that more and more I was shortening the time of this parenthesis, and it became 1979, 1982. I told this, I think, in my first lectures. When I arrived here, I realized that Ivan Minsky was probably saying this at lunch and dinners, and you find it more or less here when he says that the Federal Reserve abandoned monetarism in mid-year 1982. Why? As a response to the flight to the dollar that peaked with the Mexican and Penn Square crisis. And more general, we may consider the Latin American debt crisis and why the world needs another crash, why Latin America needed a financial crash, and so on. As I told you, when you are a big creditor, this may be a problem for you. You know, if the debtors fail. So this completely changed the attitude of economic policy. But in the meantime, something was happening in the exchange rate system. Before, in the gold exchange standard, we had fixed but adjustable exchange rates. After 72, 73, we had flexible exchange rates, but the dollar didn't go up. With the monetarist turn, the dollar skyrocketed. This became even higher as a tendency after Reagan answered the problem of the 82, changing the economic policies and going into a huge public debt. So the dollar went up and up. Actually, this article is written between, it was thought in 84, so before 85 and 87, and there was the Plaza Accord was 85 and the Louvre was 87. I told you about that. So the attempt to control with the other powers. The other powers meaning Japan and Germany, etc. A huge difference at the time, relatively to today, was that the US had military power and the power of an hegemon. Today the other subject is China. It's not the same thing as at the time. Then in this paper, what Minsky does, he clearly didn't venture too much into the international economic arena. He finds an intelligent way to apply the idea of a bank to the international monetary system. And from there it comes what I said in my first and second lectures. When US went out from World War II, they were the economic powerhouse of the world. So they had a trade account surplus. But they were an hegemon, very nasty from many points of view, but in a sense there was a benign attitude in the sense that, yes, that was also useful for them, but of course they had to take into account of the geopolitical tensions, etc. Their attitude was to provide the world with their money as the world liquidity, as in the logic of what had become, after 72-73, the dollar standard. So Minsky details very well how this was done, and it is very important, as I anticipated in the lectures before, in contrast with what was Germany's attitude. And it became the European attitude in the Eurozone, which is called by Jan Toporowski, and rightly so, monetary neo-mercantilism on money. Very often the criticism towards the Eurozone, because of this German culture, is that there is the attempt to get profits from net trade surplus, a positive surplus current account. And I told you that unfortunately in the last 4 years the attempt has been successful, too successful. But this means that your currency becomes a scarce currency, and this is a disaster. Now, the point I want to stress is that this attitude is not the attitude of an hegemon. So the criticism to be mounted against Germany is not that they are too strong, that they have a mentality, or they gave to Europe a mentality according to which for them it is important to be the strongest small person in their arena. In this way, the original project, which probably was a French one, of making the euro a competitor of the dollar, of course, is doomed from the beginning. And from this point of view, it is not strange that the United States, as Jan documented, after the 2007-2008 crisis, the United States, in the form of the Federal Reserve, had to build up the system of liquidity, actually acting as a coordinator of central banks and providing through swaps the financing of the economy. Then, if you go on in the paper, I don't go into the many details. What become clear, no, is the attempt of Minsky to build a comparison of this new world with the world of the Great Britain in the last period of the gold standard. And actually, he is forecasting what is going on, because what he says is for the system to survive and to have some equilibrium among these different poles, which includes Japan, Germany, with some European countries, etc. You have you need the United States do like Britain and go negative on the trade and service account. Emulate pre-World War I Britain. But this implies lower profits and an increased difficulty in achieving full employment within the United States. From the United States perspective, the balance of payment structure necessary for international financial stability and for continued world economic expansion implies an unfavorable profit and financial environment for domestic employment and economic expansion. Now, one point of discussion among the followers of Minsky today is that some Minskyians are embarrassed by this article, because in this article there is never a hint that flexible exchange rate systems are superior to a system of bands of fixed exchange rates managed politically. The problem becomes who is the sovereign of this world. Today there is a tendency in what is called modern monetary theory to go into, to say that if you go for the Milton Friedman, it is paradoxical, but it's so, solution of having pure flexible exchange rate, you are able to isolate yourself and you don't have any more a constraint on your economic policies. I can find, but I don't know now where they are, phrases in which Hyman Minsky takes these constraints very seriously. He does not just think that they are something that can be removed easily. I know the answer of my friend Randy Ray, because Randy Ray teaches here 2 weeks a year, and there are 3 points on which he has a problem. One is this. Another problem is that it was discovered that there is a video, the only video that you find on YouTube, in which Hyman Minsky says that taxes are good and the rich must be taxed. And it is a sort of act of faith of the modern monetary theory with some reasons that says that taxes are economically irrelevant. And this is something for them which is problematic. The third problem is of a book of the same 1986, the one that he quoted, Stabilizing in a Stable Economy, in which Hyman Minsky was worried by the rising public debt in the United States. And there is a connection between this paper and that book, because Hyman Minsky was fearing a situation in which there was a run from the dollar, not a run to the dollar as we experienced it in the crisis. People running away from the dollar, creating a constraint for the United States. Now, we may discuss the economic logic, but I think that you can't deal with this argument only in economical terms. What I think Minsky was realizing, that when you talk about this thing, you talk also of politics. It is called political economy for a reason. And as I understand his conclusions, no, they were somehow present in Jan Toporowski's presentation. Not only he says it is crazy to go into austerity, it does no little good, austerity for the debtor countries. On the contrary, what should be imposed is an emphasis upon full employment and economic expansion based upon domestic resources, Kalinsky and Schumacher and all that. There is also this idea, as I told you, that a system of political pegs on the big areas of the world and their currencies should be constructed. What made things worse, and I come to a point that I raised before, is that even though they say that we are going into a multipolar world, we are in a unipolar world in which the United States are more and more weak from the point of fundamental structure. So I think that this paper, being almost the only foray of Minsky into international political economy, is full of teachings for us, and I thank Toporowski for having actualized, in fact, a sort of second chapter of the argument in a Minskyan spirit, looking at what happened in the world of interbanking, inter-central bank reality in the last few years. Before giving the microphone to Jan Toporowski for final short comments, are there questions from the floor? I'm sure that there is one, but before I want to see if there are other students of this year that want to say something. No, so I give the microphone to Mehdi Shoghi. You have to come here. Mehdi with Kia Masudi are students of the previous courses, and they are kind enough to record these lectures. This also will be video recorded, so you will have, thanks to them, the possibility to listen again.
Thank you.
Questo è Vuoi vedere qui o guardare di là?
It's all right. I just look towards the camera. I have a few remarks on your very clear presentation, also on Gary's presentation. First of all, is that the stigmatization, of course, operates inside European financial system, which has a few architectural financial problems inside that they stigmatize further the stigmatization. So it's an endogenous problem which becomes exacerbated by a problem which also is endogenous to the whole system, because Europe was born inside this architecture from the beginning. But let's suppose for a moment, like Daniela Gabor, that the head of the European Central Bank would change and Benoît Cœuré will become the head after Draghi, and he would manage to issue European single safe assets. Still, the problem somehow remains there, although there is a lot of room to play in that. And then there is this central bank arbitrage opportunity, which I think you have remarked the Japanese central bank is actually using the Australian banking system has its brokers selling his safe asset when the shortage of the US safe asset becomes problematic, and making room for the fiscal and monetary policy. We know that there has been going some major change inside the Japanese labor market recently. The women are taken aboard, unemployment has reduced significantly, and the Japanese central banking is thinking about these more intelligently maybe than the European central banks. So maybe the Adam Tooze perspective of the Atlantic Alliance has to be somehow nuanced with the arbitrage role of the Japanese selling their safe assets, what the European central bank is not doing, should do, I think, at least. The remark on Gary's comments are that, well, there is still like Iran. The Iran part is especially important for me because Iran is hit now by severe financial sanctions that actually completely frozen the payment system. They may impede even the sales of oil in the international market because the clearance system is paid because money is a means of payment. And if they cannot use the system of payment under US hegemony, they can sell their petroleum, can't receive the dollars back. So they're not selling really. They're selling but not selling. They cannot monetize their petroleum, which is the main vulnerability of the system. So nobody is isolated from the system anymore. Nobody is isolated. So where is the solution? Where can the space be sought to create some space for fiscal deficit investment, long-term investment and capital development in these countries which desperately need them? That is an open question to me. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Jan concludes.
Okay. Very briefly, I agree with all the comments made. I'm very grateful to Annamaria and Shigari for having expanded and actually elucidated some of the points that I made too, maybe a little bit too briefly. It's interesting to see how Minsky's crisis, the one that he was writing about in this article, was resolved. In 1987 by the Baker Initiative, 1985 by the Baker Initiative, which was an attempt to get banks to lend more, commercial banks to lend more, and it failed entirely. And the subsequent one, which was the Brady Initiative, that worked. Why did it work? Because it offered guarantees for further lending, guarantees backed by Treasury, US Treasury bonds. What is Minsky also, in a sense, echoes, in many ways, echoes this earlier discussion. But I think that as I've said already, the discussion about full employment, international trade, and multilateralism. There is nowadays a concept of international equilibrium where it's defined as trade balance, but also elimination of debt. This is supposed to be a solution. Actually, elimination of debt is not the solution. The solution to a debt crisis is to have more debt. And I know this sounds paradoxical, but it's true. The issue of multilateralism comes up from this question of the deficit of the US. The way Minsky puts it across is that he puts it in a bilateral way. There's the US and there's the rest of the world. But if you look at the US deficit, with which countries is there a counterpart surplus? The counterpart surplus is with the countries of East Asia. How are they financing themselves? They're not financing themselves externally, they're internally financed. So that surplus is no good for the developing countries which are indebted abroad. These are the countries of Latin America and Africa. And this is where the problem is, that the trade deficit of the US is not transmitting itself to those countries. That, as Schumacher pointed out, that's a multilateralism problem. And then there is a European debt problem. And the European debt problem is because of the ambiguity over whether the ECB is a central bank for national governments, or if it's a central bank and a bank of issue for the whole of the European Union. And this is an ambiguity which has not been resolved, and it hasn't been resolved because, rather like the question of the lender of last resort, which doesn't exist in Europe, because of the ECB arrangement, because it was believed that this was best left to the market when the Maastricht Treaty was set up. We now have these fundamental debt weaknesses. By the way, you're quite right in pointing out that the Bank of Japan creates safe assets in Japanese yen. In Japanese, using Japanese government bonds, but also other company bonds as well. The problem is that the yen is not a currency of international debt, nor is the Australian dollar. So you find, yes, these are useful for arbitrage purposes, for the use of currency swaps as profit-making derivatives, but they're not a money market phenomenon. That's a problem.
Thank you very much. We will continue the seminar of Toporowski next week with the last two lectures, Thursday and Friday. Good weekend. See you next week.